Hi everyone. So I'm here to talk about AMD for my case analysis project. Um, Advanced Micro Devices, better known as AMD. They're a multinational semiconductor company. They develop processors and related tech for business and consumer markets. They really only have two major competitors, kind of in two separate markets that are kind of related. In the GPU market, their main competitor is Intel, and in the microprocessor market, their main competitor is NVIDIA. AMD's main product line includes products such as microprocessors, motherboard, chipsets, embedded processors, graphics processors, workstations, embedded work system applications, and solid state hard drives. So I'm going to go a little bit out of order from what the rubric said, just because I think the SWOT analysis is a better starting point. It's more of a foundation for this whole project. So I'll spare you reading all of these, but just a couple highlights. In terms of the strengths, AMD is an established global brand within very specific market segments, but they're very well established within those segments. They have, as of last year, exclusive contracts with both Sony and Microsoft to provide the chipset for next generation consoles like PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. And also last year, 2020, they purchased one of their largest competitors in the superconductor market, which is Xilinx, for 35 billion with a B dollars, and that was a stock only purchase. In terms of their weaknesses, they are competing in very volatile markets. Tech markets tend to be very volatile, and while they only have a few competitors, the competitors are also very well established companies with huge amounts of resources. A second weakness that I wanted to highlight is they only spent about $100 million in terms of advertising in 2020, which is well below what would be expected and well below any of their competitors. In terms of opportunities, I've identified several new markets that they could potentially move into. The main three really that I've identified is cryptocurrency mining, handheld mobile market, and automotive and aerospace. And there's really, as I mentioned before, there's really only a single competitor in each of these markets. So there's a high amount of volatility kind of swinging back and forth, which who has the greater share, who's coming up and who's coming down, basically. In terms of threats, recently there's been collaboration between their two main competitors, Intel and NVIDIA, which could potentially swing the balance away from AMD. And let's see. Threat number 4 specifically is actually a thing that I wanted to highlight too. In recent years, US-Chinese relations have been kind of strained, a little bit tenuous. And since AMD does a lot of their manufacturing in China and India, these foreign relations really have a huge impact on manufacturing and shipping costs. So in terms of the strategies that I kind of put together from the SWOT analysis, there's really 3 that I wanted to highlight. First being, I suggest that AMD utilizes the newly acquired Xilinx expertise in terms of their employees and their R&D, and uses that to develop new product solutions in already existing markets. And I recommend about a $500 million investment in such. Continuing on with the strength and opportunity strategies, number 3, as you can see highlighted, I recommend an increase in R&D investment by about 5% going into 2022, which would send it from just under to just over $2 billion for the total R&D budget. And this could help give them a competitive edge in these, I call them low competition markets. And that's just in terms of the number of competitors, not necessarily in terms of the volatility of the market itself. The third strategy that I wanted to highlight was a weakness threat strategy. And I recommend that based on this, this collaboration between Intel and NVIDIA, I recommend that AMD goes kind of a similar route and partners with innovative companies. I selected Tesla just as an innovative leader in the automotive and aerospace sectors, which I've also identified as markets that AMD could possibly enter and possibly thrive in. So moving on to the internal factors matrix, I'll spare you going through this whole thing, but since it's above 2.5, the total, we want to say that their internal position is fairly strong. The highest weight that I gave was really related to these exclusive contracts that they had with Microsoft and Sony, as well as the competitor buyout for Xilinx. And moving on to the external factors matrix, as you can see, based on the 2.44 total, they're a little bit below what we would expect kind of an average company to be. So there's certainly room for improvement. And here I prioritized developing trends and potential new markets as the key opportunities, and these as far as the external factors go. So moving on to the competitive profile matrix, again, the big 3 really being AMD, NVIDIA, and Intel. The biggest factor really here was the market share. And when you look at a breakdown, Intel really has about 70% of the total market, and then AMD and NVIDIA kind of evenly split the other 15% given on any given year. 2020, AMD was about 17%, and NVIDIA would be 13%. So they're kind of shifting back and forth, but it's Intel that has a huge chunk of the market share. It kind of is difficult to compare the markets though, because GPUs and the processors, they're kind of related, but they really have kind of different targets really. So we kind of lump them in together just because you can't have a market run by a single company really. So as you can see by these totals, AMD as of 2020 kind of sits right in the middle between Intel and NVIDIA. So they're not the leaders of the pack really, but they're well established within the market segments. So moving on. As far as recommendations go, I really have focused on a combination of brand awareness and targeting these new market segments that I've identified. One of the big things that happened in 2020 is NVIDIA. They introduced on their newest line of graphics cards what's called a cryptocurrency mining limiter. So with a huge uptick in cryptocurrency mining, NVIDIA has kind of backed out of using their graphics processors to target this specific market, leaving what I see to be a very large hole, a very large niche that AMD could come in and fill. The only potential downside is the perception that cryptocurrency mining is maybe a little bit shady. So there certainly is a reason that NVIDIA has backed away from doing this. But again, that being said, there is a huge kind of vacated market segment that AMD could potentially take a hold of. And in light of the NVIDIA Intel partnership that I mentioned before, I think it's imperative for AMD to maintain a competitive edge by engaging in similar partnerships. And again, the company that I've identified as a great potential partner would be Tesla. And this could lead to major advances, specifically in the automotive and aerospace industries. And the third thing that I wanted to point out is, again, in 2020, Intel lost an exclusive contract with Apple to provide all of their chipsets for their handheld devices, iPhones, iPads, etc. So that being said, there is another void really in the handheld market that AMD could come in and potentially exploit for huge economic gains. Obviously, Apple is a huge company. So the specific recommendations that I have, again, pulled from the SWOT analysis suggestions, are these 5 that I have listed here, which firstly, we need to, or AMD, AMD needs to use the expertise of this company that they acquired to develop new products within their existing markets. And I recommend about $500 million towards that. Again, I think that R&D being their strength, they really need to keep ahead of the pack in terms of the amount of money that they invest towards R&D. So I'm recommending about a 5% increase by 2022, which again just pushes it to just over $2 billion total in the R&D market. I recommend a partnership with Tesla, specifically these automotive and aerospace sectors that I've been talking about, and I recommend devoting about $1 billion to this. Number 4, recommend devoting about $500 million towards developing new and less hazardous production processes. Again, most of their manufacturing is done in, we'll call them third world countries. China kind of doesn't really fit that vibe, but India and China, low cost, low health requirements, basically. So I think recommendation of about $500 million investment towards less hazardous production processes could decrease costs in the long run and increase the customer perceptions of the company, which have in the past maybe been slightly lacking due to these the working conditions of the people that are manufacturing these component parts. And lastly, again, I mentioned that AMD kind of has been maybe not lax, but what I see is underfunding their advertising. They spent only about $100 million in 2020, which is, single-digit percentages of their total spending. Intel spends roughly 12% on advertising, which for them is, close to $1 billion. So I recommend AMD increases their advertising budget to at least compete in the percentage-wise. So about 12% would be about $500 million total investment. So moving on to the QSPM. As you can see, I have these 3 strategies that I had highlighted before. And the reason number 2 is highlighted is you will see on the next slide that is my recommended strategy out of these 3. So I don't think there's any numbers behind me, but we'll give it a quick peek. So as you can see, with a total score of 3.98, my recommended or most important strategy is to increase the R&D budget to keep ahead of the pack, which again, the R&D is AMD's competitive advantage, so it's not really a surprise. It's just kind of putting in black and white what I and what other people maybe would have already expected. So now moving on to the earnings per share, earnings before interest taxes analysis. I went with a conservative estimate of about $3.5 billion to implement all of my suggested strategies. Then I set a range of $3 billion to $10 billion for the earnings before interest taxes range. We have a tax rate of 3%, or tax rate of 21%, interest rate 3%. Stock price is hovering right around $80, maybe 83 today. I haven't checked actually, but they have about 1.25 billion shares outstanding. So as you can see from all of these very large numbers, upon analyzing, I recommend an all debt financing option. So moving on to projected financials, this is specifically the income statement. The numbers, actually, I'll skip ahead real quick just so you can get a snapshot of both of these. Due to the COVID recession, and again, one of the very first things I mentioned, the acquisition of their competitor Xilinx for $35 billion. These numbers are a little bit wonky, and I think the projections actually end up being a little bit misleading, but everything that I've seen and all of the analysis that I've done indicates that 2021 and 2022 should be very, very good years for AMD, especially if they follow my advice. So in conclusion, AMD is obviously a very well-established company. They're a benchmark company in the markets that they're already established in. They're forward-thinking and innovative. Their R&D is just off the charts amazing and is, without a doubt, their major competitive advantage compared to Intel and NVIDIA. They are globally established. They have these exclusive contracts, like I mentioned, with Sony and Microsoft for next-gen gaming consoles. And last year, 2020, they acquired a major competitor. However, they're well behind the industry leader in market share. Like I said, 70% for Intel versus about 17% for AMD. And they're heavily reliant on external manufacturing in China and India, which leads to economic tension due to tenuous international relationships. They're a US-based company, but doing all of this outsourced manufacturing can lead to huge cost increases when again, these international relationships between countries become strained. So moving forward, my recommendations are really, it's a combination of brand awareness in terms of their increasing their advertising budget and new market segment strategies in terms of penetrating these new markets that I have identified. The three major ones being handheld tablets market, cryptocurrency mining market, and automotive and aerospace. So thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed, or at least were interested in my analysis of advanced micro devices. And thank you very much.